And as you're all joining in, thank you. We're very excited. What
Oh,
up?
hello.
We did it!
Hi, Christy. Hi, Sean. Hi, Billy. Hi, Anthony. Hi, who else we got? Uh, Clearly, I got this all under control. Two
Yeah.
phones and two accounts later. I think we're going. I'll take this,
So
Jesse. I promised you an hour, so we can take this as long as you want. We don't have to cut it off at 9 if we're still
thank you
talking.
so much. I really appreciate that. And Sean Clancy, before we even get started, asked while Gary was telling his story, were you using an SNY phone?
No, I was using a personal phone. I'm not using an S. I'm not taking a company phone because that means the company can track what you do. And
Exactly.
I want my own phone. Although I guess I paid the price for that tonight because I've dropped it a few times.
Oh, no. Well, hello to everybody. Welcome back to what we're currently calling Dream Chasers here on the New York Pro Scouts channel. I'm Jesse Manning from Business Lunch Productions. And we do this every Monday and Thursday with all kinds of exciting guests. Tonight, our exciting guest is Andy Martino. You have been writing about sports for a long, long time. You do SNY now, both on air and in print. You were on the staff of the Daily News covering New York sports for years. You worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and you were a high school teacher at Brooklyn School for Collaborative Studies before that. And everybody says nowadays that teachers should be paid $1 billion, having seen this whole homeschool thing. So, Andy, introduce yourself to everybody and let us know who you are and what you do.
Well, you did a pretty good job there. That's true. And I will tell you that teaching high school, what we do in the game is challenging, but teaching high school was much harder than anything that I've done since. That is, and all the people homeschooling right now, and I'm among them. If you're watching, it's challenging. We understand that. But yeah, like you said, Jesse, I've been in the journalism business quite a while now. I'm at SNY now, covering the Yankees, Mets, Major League Baseball. As Christy said, I'm to blame for making her a baseball writer. I saw that comment because we had a child, my wife and I, in 2012. It was time to get off the beat after that first season with the baby. And lucky Christy Ackert ended up replacing me on the Mets beat on my recommendation. And Christy, I'd like to say that all the wonderful things that have happened in your life stemmed from that moment,
At
including
least.
the lovely Sean Clancy. So let's just say that I'd like to take credit for that.
How old are your kids?
I have a 7-year-old son.
So that's not quite high school age. So this is probably a new challenge in and of itself right there.
It's a new challenge, and parents have found an interesting power dynamic too, because our sweet, beautiful children are like very resentful that we're trying to act like teachers, and there's some power struggles involved that I think we've found across the nation right now, and I'm not above them.
And do you think $1 billion is reasonable for teachers once we're all done with this?
I think that is such a highly valuable, underpaid job. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. It's so challenging. People and one of the reasons I started, I was like, well, you get summers off. I want to be a writer. No. You get summers off to recover from the
Yeah.
beating that you take mentally and physically through the year. It is a tough job. And what I do now is easier and it pays better. That's not really fair.
It's a wonderful thing. No, it's not
It
fair at
works
all.
for me, but it's not fair big picture.
So before we go any further, there are some fun and inventive names in the minor leagues. There's this company that helps rename minor league baseball teams. So 3 of them, the Augusta Green Jackets, the Fort Wayne Tin Caps, the Hillsboro Hops. So Billy Blitzer, Cubs Pro Scout, named this Dream Chasers. It had a good run. We need a new name. What should we call the show, Andy?
It might be a little clunky, but I was thinking something either $ on the muscle or some kind of variation of that. That's like the classic. Scouts know what I'm talking about. That's the book. That's the phrase, $ on the muscle. It's a little long for a show title, but I'm just trying to play around with something we can do about that because that nails what this organization is about as much as the
Absolutely.
phrase.
And I don't know, you probably didn't hear it, but Billy Blitzer was just telling the story about Bobby Bonilla and how Bobby Bonilla didn't get drafted, didn't do anything because the coach wasn't playing him right. And so he gets into a room with somebody who wants to sign him, and he calls Billy and he's like, should I do this? And Billy's like, you didn't get drafted. Nobody's interested in you. I would sign that contract before that guy leaves. And so $ on the muscle.
I would like to, I'm not surprised to hear that Billy had a story, and it was a good one. And I'd like to apologize to the viewers for following Billy because Billy's stories are good. So I'm glad that my tech issue got got your viewers some quality time with Billy Blitzer.
Absolutely. So we'll go with dollar sign on the muscle and let's jump in. So you went to SUNY Purchase and your focus was journalism on the writing side of things. And then you got a master's in English education at NYU. And then you eventually went to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and received the only sports journalism scholarship they offered. None too shabby. How did that path as a student prepare you for your career now? So you started on the writing side and now you've morphed onto the screen, you do some writing. How did you get prepared by that?
Well, I always knew that I wanted to be a writer of some kind. And I think, like with a lot of us, it takes a while to figure out exactly how your interests are going to result in a career that you can do and a job that you can have and something you'll be good at. I wanted to write novels at one point. I wanted to write all kinds of different things. And, you know, my interest in baseball was just so strong. I was teaching uh, at this time. I was teaching ninth and 10th grade in Carroll Gardens, Red Hook, Brooklyn, Henry Street, right on the line of the two neighborhoods that our Brooklyn people like Billy will know, the Carroll
Henry's End.
Gardens.
You like Henry's End?
Henry's End. I don't know Henry's End. Is
Oh,
that
the
down there now?
restaurant. It's right there. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, I see. I'm like a decade removed from the neighborhood, and there's so much turnover with those restaurants over there. So I don't even know that one, but that's where I was at, and I would use like my lunch hours and weekends and stuff like that to try to figure out how I could write about baseball. It was like this organic pull. There's stories I wanted to write about the game, and there were people I wanted to know. I just really, it just started to come together. It was like I had this interest in writing, which led me to become an English teacher. But then it was like, no, I really want to be a professional writer. And the only thing I seem to want to write about is baseball. And there's just, I know that scouts can certainly relate to this feeling where you're like, I don't know why this game has this kind of pull on me. It's not rational, but it does. And that led to a path where I went back to journalism school with the idea of becoming a sports writer. And it's gone from there. It was just because the pull was in that direction, honestly. And I went after it.
100%. And if you have questions, we have a lot of people. Clearly, you seem to know some people, so they're all ribbing you. If you have questions for Andy, there's a question mark right at the bottom there. You can type them up, and we'll get Andy some questions. So, what lessons did you learn from your time as a high school teacher that have helped you in your career?
That's an interesting question. I'll give it like a earnest answer with certain social conscience. Teaching in a neighborhood which had some challenges, I think gave me and I was really young when I did it, and it taught me that there was more to the experience of growing up in this country and this world than I'd experienced. And even though I covered baseball, I tried to take some of that awareness into the sport and write about social issues where I could, or even just it gave me probably an empathy for people more. You really get close to your students.
Totally.
And I felt like if I was going to try to be a good person to my students, I also wanted to apply that to the players that I covered and the people that I covered. And that doesn't mean just like writing puff pieces about everybody all the time, but that means really trying to get to know the people you're writing about and be fair to them, and just trying to be as good of a person in this field as I tried to be in the teaching field. Aspire, not that I achieve it, but have that aspiration.
And you've had students, and I saw Cole Throws Gas as a 12-year-old who reached out to us, loves to play baseball, wanted some tips. We have kids that watch this stuff. From that perspective, for kids who have interest in being in sports and maybe they're not going to be the next Mike Trout, what from your various experiences can you impart on them?
If you're really pulled towards sports like I was, and you're not going to play at the professional level, and I wouldn't say rule it. I'm not telling any kid to rule that out, certainly prematurely. But if you get to the point where you're like looking for a different path, all I can speak to my experience of, like I just described, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I loved the game. And those two things kind of gradually merged into trying to write about the game. It took a while to get there. So whatever it is you do, I mean, there's plenty of people that want to be involved in the front office side or the business side or the scouting side, and there's so many different ways that you can be a part of the game. I mean, Jesse, you don't work in the industry, and here you are talking to baseball people and dealing with baseball people. So there's no shortage of ways to be involved. And I'd say there's no easy answer, but it's just like an organic process of figuring out what you're good at and what you want to do, and how it can relate to those sports.
100%. And I think that's really valuable. And it's just, if it's what you want, then you just got to keep working towards it and don't give up. And there's always another avenue in. If it's not the first one, then there's another door or a window, and you just got to figure it out, you know? Um, you said something about the pull of the game. Can you just speak to that? There is something about baseball where, especially when you're in the community,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's an addiction. Can you just talk about that?
There's the game. Yeah, there's two pieces I think you just touched on. There's the game itself, which probably most of the people in this little community right now would agree, or because that's why you would watch something like this. There's something about the game that I mean, look, a boring baseball game will bore all of us. It's not like every game has that magical pull, but we love. There's so many things about the sport. I mean, I've learned something new every year, and I'm sure scouts continue to learn. So uh, it's that depth that you can go into with the game that I think is part of what keeps you coming back for more. Um, I know you'd plan on talking about this later, but just quickly, I'm researching a book right now about the Astros, so I'm learning so much about pitch tipping and sign stealing and these traditions. So I didn't know really what a sign sequence looked like through a decade plus of covering the game, and now I know what outs plus one is and different ways that catchers what that means when the catcher's doing all that stuff that even a baseball writer doesn't necessarily look at closely. So it's just like, and I know that if they were playing right now, I'd be learning something new. So I think that's part of the addiction. And then there's the community, the world of baseball.
Yeah.
Which again, for all of us, some days is just dragging your ass to work and not loving it. But we do really like circulating in the the cafeteria of any stadium, shooting the breeze about the game before. I love running into Billy Blitzer at Citi Field or Yankee Stadium and just, hey, how you doing? Talk about our families, talk about the game, talk about what you see. It's just, we share a common interest, we share a common passion, those of us who are in the game, and it's nice to gather around that, talking to players, talking to each other. That's why I love going to the scout dinner that Billy organizes every January, because it's a night of telling those stories and talking about that stuff. And we all share that in common. There's probably people, I'm sure there's people in this just in this audience who share wildly different views on things from politics to whatever else, but we do share this common passion, and that's what's nice about the community. And by the way, what we miss about it right now, and I'm excited that baseball looks like it's going to return this year, and I'm glad, I'll be thrilled to watch it on television this summer, but I will miss being part of the community at the ballpark starting 2 or 3 o'clock every afternoon and going till midnight. I'm really going to miss that.
100%. We've got 2 audience questions, one from Sean, one from Christy. So Sean says, if you're a commissioner for a day, what would be the first thing you'd change?
I would create a permanent rule that would exist beyond my term and I would write it in some way where it could never be changed, that the designated hitter would never come into the National League. I'm really
awesome.
Bummed that there's momentum toward that, because I think it creates a brisker game. I think the DH takes us further away from baseball in its ideal form is probably 2.5 hours tops.
Right.
A little brisker, a little zippier, like I'm sure it was every day in the 60s and 70s. And DH is one of the factors that takes us away from that. And I'm willing to watch pitchers take ridiculous swings in order to keep the strategy and the pace going.
Bartolo Colon with the helmet flying off.
Hey, well, that's entertaining. You lose that, but Sean, I know I see you're taunting me in the comments right now, and I take your point. But look, I like the National League, and now we have an example of both. So it's too bad that it has to be, or looks like it's probably going to be unified at some point that way. My opinion.
Christy wants to know what your favorite story that you've ever written is.
My favorite baseball story, probably 2. One is, and this is just off the top of my head, and we're thinking about Billy, but I did get the chance to spend a lot of time with Billy a few years ago, and he scouted a game, and he let me sit next to him in Reading, and then did a little deeper dive into his life, and learned a lot about scouting. Billy, if you may not realize this, but when I got to sit next to you in that game, like, we watched the guy's arm action slow down in his changeup, and you pointed it out, and I went, oh, that's what that looks like. And just things that you scouts would take for granted. So that was a real experience being able to write that. And then, Billy, you told me that Joe Madden, so I wrote that in prior to the 2016 postseason. Like, Billy's Cubs might finally win. And you told me that Madden talked about the story, and that you got some praise on that, and that was great that you got that experience. So that's probably my favorite story for that. And then I've just been so into this Astros thing lately, and I find it so fascinating that the couple of pieces of news I've been able to break on that have been something that I've felt good about.
Very, very cool. So I witnessed a moment. We're talking about these moments. My friend Matt, who's watching, I used to work for MLB Advanced Media with him, and he called me last year. He was at Yankee Stadium for the Subway Series. And so he said he had just seen this amazing thing. Pete Alonso, rookie year, first Subway Series, and Matt just happened to be down on the field doing something, and Pete's there at home plate, arms out, looking up to
Mm-hmm.
the sky and slowly turning around going, wow, you know, and just appreciating that moment that he was in, sort of like a kid in a way. Have you had any moments that either you felt sort of imposter syndrome, like where we all sometimes feel, where am I, or just human emotion wise, that you really appreciated what you were a part of?
I try to feel that way as often as possible because it's a grind sometimes. And I always try to remember how badly I wanted to be part of the business when I wasn't yet, and when I was striving for it. So I try to look around the field, and there are times I think that's a little easier. There's something obviously really special about an empty field after a game. Sometimes, so that would, I guess, be a specific answer to that question. There are times when I get to shoot a like a stand up for SNY for the late show on the field after the game, and there's still like the cleat marks and the
100%.
dirt, and uh, there's an energy in the stadium. Like, let's say the Aaron Judge just hit a game-winning home run in Yankee Stadium. The stadium's empty an hour later, but there's still like a little buzz in the air. Like, there's not really, but you can still feel it. And you look around, you're like, all that energy and all that stuff happened in this spot, and here I am on the
Totally.
field. And that line between the last line of the seats and the field is a huge line to cross,
Yeah.
right? So for years, it's like I bought a ticket, get me on the other side of that gate. So I do think when I am there and I'm like maybe the only person standing there other than a cameraman, I'm like I do look around and I'm like I really appreciate this.
It's funny you say that because I had that moment. I never realized it until you said it, but at Wrigley Field, the first game I worked there, and I'd been on the field, whatever, but after the game, it was dark out. It was maybe an hour after a night game, and there were the people with the leaf blowers cleaning
Mm-hmm.
up the stadium. The lights are off, and you're just there, and there is this like aura and mystique, and it's like there's nothing like it.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for reminding me I did that.
Hey, those are big moments, and I don't appreciate all of them. Sometimes when I get me home, I'm tired, I'm cranky, but I like when I'm at my best, I make sure to note it.
100%. So I read an article that you wrote. I still call it Mets blog. I'm used to it being Mets blog, so I search it as Mets blog. It's sny.tv now, that you wrote recently. It was a couple weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
where you talked in retrospect about how you feel like you may have dehumanized Matt Harvey when he was with the Mets. He was such an enigmatic player and enigmatic guy. He loved it, and he fed off of all of it. Can you just talk about the relationship with Matt, I guess specifically, and then with players in general, how
Mm-hmm.
that goes?
I think with Matt, like the reason I reflected back on that, I mean, the cause for it was that he had posted a video of him throwing, so people were talking about him a little, and I just thought I had actually been kind of like a ally of his. I had a column at the time, so I was able to express an opinion. And when the Mets organization, the front office, would be down on him, I would try to say, no, this guy's like the Joe Namath of our time. He's big. And so I thought I was doing him a service, but when I thought back on it, it was like, did I want him to be that guy because of him or because I wanted to cover a Joe Namath in my, because I
Yeah,
wanted it to be that way. And instead of seeing him for what he was, which is kind of a complicated, at times troubled guy, that kind of built him up a little bit, maybe. I think Christy Ackert covered Matt better than anybody. Just worked him as a beat, stayed on him every day, got him to talk to you. I know, Christy, I'm addressing you as you're watching, but that's if any rest of you read the Daily News Mets coverage when Harvey was in his Met years, it was mostly Christy, and it was just accurate and newsworthy and da-da-da. And there I am with my columns going like, oh, he's Joe Namath. And I just, I look back on it, I was like, I probably have done that a little bit differently. You always try to reflect on what you do, and you know, see like, oh well, next time something comes around, what would I tweak? And that was an example of something I read back in the columns and they felt like a little much.
100%. Do you feel like you have a different relationship with players? Did you learn something from that experience, maybe in retrospect, or how do you approach that relationship?
My relationship with players probably becomes more business-like as the years go by. Like when I first started, I was very much their age, and you develop probably a bit more of like go have a beer with the guy and you know your peers really, guys you might have gone to high school with or something like that. But now that I've been doing it a while, I've seen like so many different groups of guys come and go. A little more perspective on that. I'm older than most of the league. I think I'm older than a couple of managers, which is like a whole other line to cross.
Crazy.
Yeah. And so I think what I probably adjusted into a little bit more is like, here are my questions. I'm like, what are your answers? We don't, let's have a professional interaction. And in some ways, I think that's better because these guys have their own friends, and so do I. We don't really need to. I mean, you're going to connect with some people and really like them and carry it forward from there. But I would say my approach is probably a little bit more. I don't mean this is a bad thing at all, but like just a little bit more professional or transactional or like, um, yeah, like just acknowledging that at a certain point, even age-wise, I'm not their peer anymore and making a slight adjustment.
Hmm. That's pretty interesting. So, who like is it different with managers? Do you have a different relationship or the scouts? Like we can unpack the scouts probably
Mm-hmm.
for days. Maybe that would be the one to key in on.
Mm-hmm.
You rely on them a lot. They're still associated with teams, but they're not on the field every day. So, how are those relationships within the game different?
Scouts are the best of all the categories: agents, players, front office, scouts, managers, because no group of people, I mean, some of you are difficult, but for the most part, no group of people likes to talk about the game more than the scouts, and there's just less uh, uh, nonsense to go through. Like you can talk to a GM, but he's still like thinking like a GM, and he's talking to the media. It's like, oh, what do I want to tell him? I don't want to tell him. But I'm like, hey Billy, hey Joe Rogoli, hey whoever, like, what do you see? Oh, here's what I see. Great, let's talk about baseball. There's none of that other stuff, hoops that you have to jump through with most scouts. And I appreciate that so much because we can just talk about the game that we're both interested in. And 99.9% of scouts are so generous with their insight. Sometimes I'm like, why are you telling me all this stuff? uh, but so that's great. I like managers a lot too because most of them are a little bit more obviously just mature in life. I have played. A lot of them weren't great players, so they have some humility from that, I think. Some of them are really still difficult. I guess it's just like any group of people. I mean, I've found there are fewer people that I've ever met that are harder to have a decent conversation with than Mike Matheny. And be like, dude, what can you just like I'm like I remember one time there was something going on. It was pretty simple. Whatever issue was going on in the game that day. And I was like, Mike, what's your perspective on da da da? The Cardinals were in New York. It's like, I'm not here to talk about the issues of the day. It's like, oh, God. But most of them are really cool and interesting and nice. We had Terry Collins in New York for years, and we'll never see another like him. Talk about an ally to scouts. I mean, this is a guy who was really troubled by the way that scouts were getting marginalized by some organizations, including his own in some ways. But others were other teams obviously worse, the Astros, etc. With scouts. And Terry was just such a salt of the earth guy. And you'd walk into his office and you'd be like, Terry, I'm not challenging you, but I really want to know why you didn't pinch run for that guy. And he'd go, all right, since you want to know, well, so-and-so was up fourth in the next inning and da-da-da, and you connect the dots. And you're like, oh, thanks. Some guys are defensive, and he wasn't. Aaron Boone's great. Girardi would get very defensive. So it's just like individual, I think, based on who they are. But managers are fun. And players can sometimes be, there's such a range. Some of them are these really interesting, sensitive, intellectual types. And some of them are like, you remember that kid on the beach in, I think it was Clearwater or Florida somewhere like 6 weeks ago that was like not doing the quarantine. And he was like this dumbass kid on the beach. Like 10% of players are that guy. So there's just a wide range.
No naming of names. So you mentioned earlier you're working on this research project, which will become a book
Yeah.
because a book takes how many years does a book take
Well,
from
this one's got to be a little quicker because it's newsy. I mean, I've been um, working hard in this. Normally, a book would take a year or two to write. This one's I'm gonna write in half a year or something because I've got
wow.
a little time right now. It needs to be released relatively soon while people still care about this story. It'll be out either later this year or early next at the latest. So I'm sort of stepping on the gas with it a little bit, but I had the built-in advantage of covering the story as it was going on. So I actually had a lot of the reporting done by the time I decided to put it into a book, just by virtue of reporting on the whistling controversy from the Astros versus Yankees series, being at that series. All winter, I was trying to figure out if Altuve was wearing a buzzer. I've got all that legwork done, so that accelerates the process of writing the book a little bit.
That's really exciting for you too, especially it's something you're passionate about and that you get
Yeah.
to dive into it. And this pandemic being the perfect storm is kind of interesting, where you can now just writing a book in 6 months sounds horrifying to those of us who didn't go to journalism school.
Oh, it is. But uh, I mean, that's one thing that this situation's provided is a little bit more time at home.
Yeah.
So
So
speeding along.
let's talk about the scandal itself. What have you learned? I saw you wrote something recently comparing the Astros and the Red Sox and the punishments that were doled out, something about Carlos Delgado. So you're in all facets of this. And then
Mm-hmm.
there was the Apple Watch situation a few years back. Can you just unpack all of what's going on?
Well, one thing I'm trying to do is put the Astros in context and be fair to them and say, like, to what extent were they part of what's always happened in the game, and to what extent were they worse, if any, right? So looking at the whole picture, like the research I've done now goes all the way back to when did pitch tipping start? Well, it turns out it started, I think it was 1876 when they lifted a ban on the overhand on an overhand pitching motion. So all of
Right.
a sudden you could have a tip or a tell. And so sign stealing goes from there. Teams were using buzzers in 1900. Uh, there was the 1911 New York Highlanders were suspected
That
of
was the
sign
Giants before the Giants, right? Or is it or the Dodgers
before the Yankees.
before
Yeah.
the
So the
Yankees?
Highlanders were the
One of them.
Yankees, and when they were still the Highlanders, the Tigers thought they had a guy with a spyglass in the scoreboard. So the Tigers coaches ran up to the scoreboard to catch him, and the guy had left, but there was still a full glass of beer and a cheese sandwich in the scoreboard. That was evidence that someone had been up there. So the point is, like the Astros, and of course everyone here probably knows the history of Ralph Branca and Bobby Thompson, the stolen
Right.
signs in '51. So defenders of the Astros have said, well, what about that? And what I've kind of landed on that was, yes, there have been examples of this kind of thing throughout baseball history, but it's actually always been a big deal when they've been caught. Ralph Branca, the last 60 years of his life were seriously impacted by this. I talked to his son-in-law, a friend of some people here, Bobby Valentine, said, Ralph was pissed about this and hurt his whole life. So for anyone defending the Astros to say, well, the Giants did it in '51, it's like, yeah, and it ruined Ralph Branca's life in a way. So that's not okay. So there's been that stuff, and I also think what the Astros did was really unique in a nutshell because they had this unique. It was like a perfect storm of circumstances. You had a technologically savvy front office that knew how to make algorithms. You had Beltran and Cora, who were good guys, but were really good at their whole career at picking up on stuff with their eyes. And then all of
Right.
a sudden, you put an Edgertronic camera, scouting camera, in front of them that takes 1,000 frames per second,
Yeah.
and Carlos Beltran's going to see that monitor and see that catcher and not try to figure out the sequence. So all these things are happening at once, and the Astros end up getting signs to hitters with nobody on base, which crosses a line, I think, that's pretty bad in the eyes of a lot of baseball people. So I think that because of technology, because of personnel, they were worse. They were part of a context, but they were worse. What the Red Sox have been accused of doing under Cora in 18 just wasn't the same thing. It was illegal, but you had to have a runner on base. There wasn't this broad scheme like with the front office and everything. It was misdemeanor, while the Astros was a felony, I think. And I also think that a significant amount of teams were using the replay room the way the Red Sox were, but no one else was banging a garbage can, to my knowledge.
I've heard the same thing from people that were in those replay rooms, and it's a weird position to put people in too, because that's the side that I was on, and that Matt's on is like that broadcast technology side. A year or two ago, they just decided to tell some operator, okay, now you have to sit in the dugout or in the clubhouse and tell Aaron Judge he can't use his cell phone during the game. It's like this impossible situation.
Right.
So it's just a very weird thing. You also talked a little bit about just like where they fit into things. I'm working, or my company, we're working on this documentary on Tom Giordano, and we were during the perfect storm with the Braves. We just happened to be there. We were talking to the powers that be there, and things make different sense in context when you watch them back later. But then it was forgotten about, right? John Coppolella was banned from baseball for life. So where does what happened here, and I heard he wasn't cooperative or whatever it was, but you know, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Pete Rose, John Coppolella versus 1 year bans. Can you just give some context to that whole thing too?
Well, you're right. Coppolella was banned because the one thing you don't do to Rob Manfred's investigators is lie. And if you do, he makes an example of you. That's what happened to Coppolella. So that's one piece there. I think it's interesting. You comparing different moral problems. I guess it gets problematic, right?
Yeah.
Worse, this or that. It's hard to say. I do think that I accept that that MLB had to offer the players immunity from punishment to get them to talk the way that the system is set up and the way that it works. If they wanted to get the story like as fully as they did, and Astros players went in there and laid it out, what they did with the trash can, because they knew they weren't going to get punished. So that's the thing that I don't have as much of a problem with maybe as some, and other players wanted them punished, but I think MLB might have said, well, your union doesn't want them punished. So I think that was tough. But yeah, it's a tough, Hinch and Cora and Lunau getting a year versus Shoeless Joe for life or beyond life, things like that. That doesn't seem quite equitable. Those are tough situations to compare. Those are steroid guys that are back in the game. Maybe that's okay, maybe that's not, but it does seem like wildly different punishments for different crimes. I agree with you.
So let's talk about tech in the game and in the context of scouting too. Where is it going? Where does it go from here? And will we see a Billy Blitzer again? Will we see a Joe Rigoli again? Or, you know, what do you think on that stuff?
Well, we'll never see the likes of Billy Blitzer again. And I mean that as a compliment. Or Joe Rigoli, but I know what you're saying. I think that the future of the pro scout is, God willing, it's secure, because as one of the pieces of reporting I did for this book is on the situation where the Astros fired so many of their pro scouts in 2017, right before they're about to win a World Series. And the argument that Jeff Lunau made at that time was, I don't need you if I get a ballpark where there's a track man. And what he egregiously missed, which a lot of GMs I think still understand, I hope still understand, is that the track man can't work the beat writers. The track man can't tell you how a player's body language was before the game and make those calls. You know, the Astros traded for Ozuna. What's part of what pro scouts do is make those calls of diligence, those off the record calls. Hey, how bad was that situation? What kind of guy is this? Obviously, the track man, the Edgertronic, et cetera, can't do those things. So I think the future of pro scouting emphasizes probably the interpersonal and the reporting skills that you guys are reporters, scouts, in a lot of ways. And obviously, your valuable eye. If I'm a GM, like let's say if I'm a GM, it's not that different from Brian Cashman being a GM, right? In the sense that neither of us played professional baseball. We're guys who try to learn about the game.
Your dad raced horses with George Steinbrenner.
Well, if he had, maybe I would be the GM of the Yankees. But since my dad didn't know anybody, I'm here. But I'm saying, like, so what Cashman does well, I think, is like picture him at a conference table. On one side of that table is Jim Hendry and Tim Nearing and some scouts, and maybe they're not always as heard in an analytics organization, but they're there. They're at the table. They're being listened to, and then you've got the analytics guys on the other side, and the GM then is taking it all in and making a decision. If some guy like Jeff Lunau didn't realize that that was a good thing, and he burned a lot of bridges and cost a lot of people their jobs. I think that model of listening to both sides, as long as the scout side is willing to sort of modernize a bit and not be hostile to new things, is probably the future. But I cannot imagine a smart organization not thinking that both amateur and pro scouts are necessary.
Do you feel like this is the normal progression? People talk about Moneyball and it went so far in one direction and then came back. And do you agree there's sort of like an ebb and a flow to these things?
I don't know. Like when the Royals did well for a few years, I think it was, or even the Giants, I think it was held up as like, and maybe the Nationals this year, that narrative of, but I think those narratives are a little simple. The Nationals have an analytics department, obviously. They just don't advertise it as much as some teams. Um, I think like history goes in one direction, right? In the direction of innovation. And I think that analytics and technology, well, there have been a few teams that have had success that don't value it. I think it's only going in that. I don't know if I would see it as ebbs and flows. I just think that different teams know how to use the stuff well in its proper place, and some teams overdo it, right? And the teams that are successful, like the Cubs, too, it would be an example of an organization where, I mean, Theo, obviously a analytics guy at his core, but has done a lot to well, I don't want to speak for people who work for the Cubs, but it seems to me, I'll say it seems to me from the outside that there's been more respect for scouts there than some other places. Cashman, Theo, Ben Charrington, there are guys that understand both sides, and I think that's, it's not so much an ebb and flow as that the successful ones embrace both, in my opinion.
And you look at the people they had there too. Joe Madden or Anthony Iapoce, who we saw is here. He was talking on the show with Joey Jarzinka earlier. Anthony Rizzo is the kind of guy, come put your arm around you, how you do. It's like they found people make the difference too.
Hmm?
So like you were saying, that human element is just, you can't trade that for anything. All right, rapid fire here. So I'm going to ask you some things. You just answer quickly the first thing that comes to your head. Favorite ballpark food?
City Field. I don't mean to be a homer in New York, but they have so many different options. There's a Shake Shack. There's good pizza. There's like seafood. They do a really nice job with the concessions. So there's like 5 things there that are pretty delicious.
Journalism icon or hero?
Oh boy, I would say Bill Knack at SI wrote a lot of horse racing, but some other sports. Best sports long form writer in history. Someone who was writing literature, just happened to be sports. Passed away not too long ago. I get to cover a Belmont Stakes. He was like a turf writing legend. I got to cover a Belmont next to him in the press box once. So it was a huge thrill. And he wrote some baseball too, so that would be mine. Bill Knack.
Mac or PC?
Definitely Mac. I'm too, as you saw in the first 15 minutes of this thing, I can't even handle Apple products. Imagine me with like a Dell.
Favorite player growing up?
Mark McGwire. I was born in 1980, and the Bash Brothers. I think if you're my age, it was either Griffey or the Bash Brothers. Those were the 2 most charismatic baseball type figures at that time, and so I really liked McGwire there for a few years.
Favorite season of the year?
I would go with summer, but in the Northeast, like the first half of summer, like June into July. Yeah, and then it's just cooked and it's terrible. Baked, but yeah, summer.
You did very well. All right, that was rapid fire. So now let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. It's timely and things are just different for everybody. So you were down in Florida while this was happening. Just talk about what was your experience like and how has this been different than whatever you're used to?
Well, in Florida, I was gone. I just by happenstance. By the time it really started to empty out, Chris Yackert was there still at the outside George Steinbrenner Field in Tampa, and a few people that I know were certainly in Port St. Lucie and around. But I had just happened to have flown home a little before that, so my spring training was weird because everyone was popping off about the Astros. Think like this spring training was like at two of the weirdest segments. The
Yeah.
first half was people can only kill the Astros and not talk about anything else, and the second half was there's a global pandemic. Pretty weird
Right.
spring.
Oh yeah.
So there was that, but I mean, then just now, I'm sure I'd be at a ball game right now instead of sitting in my basement. If so, that's one way that it's different. Uh, there's so many ways in our lives that we've been grounded here, and that's tough. Uh, so yeah, I would say with the baseball scene, it's just been. I mean, there almost has been nothing to say, right? We just haven't been around baseball people. There's a community that we're used to that we talked about before that doesn't exist. It only exists virtually right now, and that's just weird. It's tough.
And maybe too much time for introspection.
You think? Yeah, that's why I wrote that navel gazing Matt Harvey column.
Yeah.
Sitting in my house all day.
So you've been reporting a lot on the potential solutions, which I guess would be what it is. And I've seen you tweeting about the games in Korea. I guess you've been watching some of those. What is your thinking on the current prognosis, and which is your favorite solution you've heard?
I can tell you they're dead set on playing by late June, early July, meaning you get spring training. I hear about 20 days of spring training. This is all tentative right now, but this is what my reporting is right now. I'm sure guys that work for organizations that are on here have heard similar things. No, I would be surprised if there were fans in the seats this year. Maybe way later, see how the coronavirus proceeds, and that will decide it. Obviously, my favorite is probably I gotta admit I'm a little concerned with some of these more recent thoughts that have involved some travel for the players. My favorite is probably with the ones that have them in one location or two locations stationary, just because you think, and that's what Dr. Fauci and Governor Cuomo and some people were enthusiastic about, was get the players sealed off,
Right.
them like every day, and keep it safe that way. That makes sense to me. Now when we start talking about regions and hubs, it's like, ugh, well, are they going home at night? Are they stopping at the bar on their way home? Then you start to wonder a little bit. But I think part of the reason behind that is that MLB would like to have games in at least a few different time zones so they can be televising games all day. They have to answer their TV partners too, of course. There's a lot that goes into this. But I guess I hope they're in just one or two places for their own safety.
Yeah, I mean, and they're set up for Arizona and Florida. And when I was in spring training in Arizona, they would do 1 o'clock games. They do 4 o'clock games. So you could, in theory, just stagger it or something. But
you could.
What are some of the best things, or the best thing that's happened to you since you've been dealing with this? We hear a lot about negative, but positively, what's the best thing that's happened?
Well, we had a cool one today. My son got sick of the homeschool, but he's been listening to podcasts lately, and he wanted to make a podcast. It was all his idea, so I sat down at the computer, and I was like, all right, what's the story? He wrote the script, I typed it up, we recorded on GarageBand, and he made, it was actually did a really good job with it, and narrated it, and knew when to put in, this podcast is sponsored by, he had the whole structure down. And I was really impressed. Every once in a while, your kid will blow you away with this leap. It's how are you capable of this? So I had one of those today, and that was a highlight for sure.
Who is his sponsor? Who is his sponsor?
It's funny. He made it the bookstore in our town, which is also cool.
That's awesome.
And that was noon. So he would have been in school and I would have been at work. Those are the times that I get with him that I'll remember. And then I wouldn't have had, it's not worth the pandemic, but it's a silver lining.
That's really, really cool. All right. So now we're going to do some baseball cards. So I'm going to turn the camera around and I'm going to show you.
All right.
Todd Zeal, first thing or story, your friend over there.
Yeah. Todd's become a really good friend over the few years I've worked with him. I really appreciate him as a guy. He's as grounded as a ball player could be, but also really interesting. He worked for Charlie Sheen for a decade. He was his right-hand man. I don't know if a lot of people know this. Todd was one of the creators of the series Anger Management, and he was the guy, and everyone thinks that means he's straight, or that he's a wild man, but he's actually a straight arrow. He was the sober keep Charlie in line guy. So he's just like, he's got weird experiences like that. And he's also just always accessible, willing to talk about the game. Was a stud player, right? He was
Yeah.
a guy, and he doesn't act like one. He's just generous colleague, good friend. So one of the people in the game who I appreciate knowing probably the most.
All right. The theme of most of the rest of this, is second baseman. So we'll start with Robbie Alomar.
Uh, I mean, he was, as a kid, I never covered him, but watching as a kid, I mean, what a player. I remember actually I grew up in Rochester, New York, so we would go to the Sky Dome a couple times a year. That was our big league city.
Yep.
And watching him, he was just unbelievable on both sides of the ball. Probably underrated. I know he's in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
But still, like, people like, no, oh my God, this guy was so ridiculously good. And that's my memory of him.
Next one is Chase Utley. You were in Philly for a bit.
Best player I've ever seen on a daily basis. Like, Hall of Fame player who just didn't have the length in his career and had the injuries. I covered Utley and Howard on the beat for a little over a year. Coming into it, Howard's like the MVP type guy. You think that's the guy. You watch the two of those guys play day in and day out, and there's no comparison. Utley does so many little things. I mean, he would be positioning his outfielders from behind his back with his hand. He would be picking up on sequences and pitch tipping. He would be was so knowledgeable of the game, such a good hitter. There was one time, remember the lefty for the Giants, Jonathan Sanchez, was kind of a loose cannon. He throws it Utley once. It's a late game in San Francisco. It was empty enough and late enough where you could hear Utley screaming at Sanchez for knocking him down. And then Utley hits a home run, and he's screaming obscenities at Sanchez all the way around the bases. Like, you knock me down, I'm going to hit it out, and I'm going to yell at you. He was just, like, so hard-nosed and so good. So, all the little things, and just, like, to watch that guy play all day long.
All right. Next second baseman, maybe from your childhood and then maybe after, Jeff Kent on the Mets.
I saw him do one of the roughest things a player's ever done to a media member. I happened to be in the clubhouse in L.A. when Kent was a Dodger, and he didn't like, I guess, the columnist T.J. Simers. So T.J. Simers is in the clubhouse after a game, and Jeff Kent's two kids are there, two boys. And he goes, boys, come here. And then he's like, TJ, come here. And he points at TJ Simers, and he's like, this is the kind of man I never want you to be. And it was super awkward.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. All right. And then last one, Robinson Cano.
What a sweet swing. Too bad for the Mets that he has 4 more years on his contract. How about that for both sides of the coin?
If you had to pick one, first off, I guess, well, Robbie's in the Hall of Fame. The other 3 are somewhat comparable. I mean, they all did different things. Who of those groups, the other 3, are Hall of Famers in your opinion?
Cano obviously would be, but the PED suspension makes that a question. Utley was a Hall of Fame talent who didn't have the years and the production. Who else did you show me at the beginning?
Jeff Kent.
That's it. He probably is a Hall of Famer, right? I mean,
he should be, I would think.
Yeah.
You get to vote for that sort of thing, don't you?
I don't vote.
Not anymore?
I never did.
It's 10 years, or what's the
I've
minimum?
got the time, and I've chosen not to vote for a lot of reasons. It's actually hard. I want to vote. It's fun. It's like, I'll lighten up and vote. I just don't like the way the whole thing's set up. I don't like how the Hall of Fame's kicked the PED question to the writers with no standards for it and no guidance. I don't like that approach. I don't like to have the idea that I have to be the moral arbiter of that. I don't like the idea that players appear on the ballot who I know through reporting use PEDs, but they're not proven, and I got to deal with that. And it's like, you know what, Hall of Fame, no thanks. That's kind of my view on that. You deal with it.
That's reasonable. And Gary wants your son's resume, by the way. But after the podcast and sponsorship stuff, I guess Gary's interested. So
well, we'll have to polish up the resume. But Gary, thank you for that. That's why I'm on here, is to sell. That's why I agreed to do this. So
I've got my last question, and then we'll see if there's any more audience questions. Mm-hmm. But what does baseball mean to you?
It's so hard to summarize, and I think we covered it in so many of the different questions and answers that we had. But I guess it means more to me than I would ever have thought. It's gone right now, and I miss it so much that I would think like, God, there's part of me that would like to live in Europe or do something else or something completely different or be somewhere that baseball wasn't relevant in at all. And then I'm like, I don't know, man. I would miss it. It's the thing I write about. It's the thing I like to be around. It's the people that I know. So I guess it means like everything to me somehow. It's a child's game, and here I am, 39 years old, and that's how I feel. That's how we all feel. But it means a lot.
That's a reasonable answer. And then, did you root for the Red Wings growing up, or like
Mm.
who was your team?
Yeah, I did. It's
Bigger
funny.
than
I was a Red
Major
Wings
League?
fan. Yeah. So my dad and I would go to Red Wings games all summer long. Big Red Wings fan. You get to know the players in the minor league cities, obviously, a little bit better, and that was great. I kind of jumped around as a Major League fan when I was a kid because I was such a Red Wings fan. So like when the A's were good a couple years and I was little, I was into them. Then I got into the Braves for the 90s. Like I guess the bulk of it starting in 91 because if you're my age, that's the only team that was on every day
Right.
nationally.
On
And
TV,
they were
yeah.
so good, right? They're on TBS. So I was into the Braves through the 90s probably. But honestly, if you had to, I'm glad you said the Red Wings because more than any Major League team, that's my team.
If I knew that you were from Rochester, I found the rest of it out, but I make these little sets. I have a Red
Mm-hmm.
Wings hat because I went to camp outside of Rochester. I would have
Oh,
put
yeah?
that. This is your set. I would have put it on your set. So next time.
Well, I appreciate the diligence anyway in getting the Mets and Yankees stuff. That's something.
Is there anything else you feel like is interesting, is on your radar we may not have covered? People might, something you want to say to get back at Christy and Sean who have been ribbing you?
They have. I've seen a lot of that go by, and I've acknowledged some of it. And, as somebody who is responsible for your relationship, and for those who don't know what I'm talking about, Christy's not covering baseball if I don't leave the beat. Christy and Sean not necessarily spending the quality time if Christy's not in the baseball world. So I don't know if there are deeper issues that you guys are working out through these comments directed at me, or if or what it is. But I'd like to take credit for your happiness.
I think that kind of hits on everything. I really appreciate you taking the time. Oh, and Sean asked what the hat was. That was the other
Oh,
thing. What's your hat?
this is Stax Records. It was a record label in Memphis. We toured it with my family last summer. Like Otis Redding and Mavis Staples and a lot of the 60s soul stuff was recorded. Elvis recorded there. So I think it's a cool logo, and I love a lot of that music. So Stax Records. And we got a quarantine fro going on under here, so that's the reason the hat is on in the first place.
Taming it.
Yeah.
Did you see Anthony McCarron's beard? He came on the show, and everyone was like, whoa.
Anthony's had some big hair over the years, but he's never had a beard until now. I have seen, and we're all doing extreme things with our hair these days out of necessity. You look relatively groomed. I don't know how you're doing it.
Well kempt. Well, you should see me when I'm not doing a show.
That's the only time you're presentable. That's understandable.
Thank you so much for joining us and
pleasure.
Joining Instagram sort of just to make this work. We really appreciate it. We are coming back on Monday with Bobby Valentine at 8 o'clock, which is super exciting. And then Anthony, I posted with Thursday with the Cubs hitting coach. So we've got a great slate going on. This has been $ on the muscle. I think that's a pretty great name for the show. And Andy Martino, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And thanks to all the scouts who are watching for everything that you do. I would do an hour on Instagram any day of the week for you guys. You're my favorite part of the game.
All right, everybody. Have a great night. And Andy, thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.